Today, we are continuing our series, The Four Foundational Questions of Jesus, while taking a closer look at Matthew 10. So far, Glenn and Carl have taken us through Jesus' inquiries of who is my neighbor and who is my family. The next question we will examine today is a little bit different of a relationship and a question, and that is, who is my disciple? What do you think of when you hear the word disciple? I assume most of you will imagine the 12 disciples of Jesus that he selects throughout the Gospels. You might picture bearded men in tunics following Jesus from town to town as he collects them all like Pokemon. When we think of disciple, we usually picture something from the ancient world, don't we? Something that existed in the time of Jesus, but removed from our context. I think this is especially true because there is not a common modern use for the word disciple. If you hear it, it is most likely within a religious context. It has made discipleship seem something a little bit more than we can see or understand on the surface. For me, it felt like many of the Christian traditions we are familiar with have presented discipleship as something a little mystifying. Discipleship was something that felt like a very spiritualized experience where you mystically develop your formation as a follower of Jesus. It was something that the Holy Spirit worked within you as you pursued righteous or holy living. Discipleship felt more like what these traditions called sanctification, the process of being made holy or without sin. But in reality, discipleship, especially in the text, is much simpler than that. A disciple really is just a student. To be a disciple of someone means that they are pupils of a particular teacher and are closely studying and following the school of thought that that teacher represents. Jesus was the disciples' university or degree program, so to speak, and the disciples in the Gospels have all agreed to be lifelong and committed students to him. The disciples in the Gospels are followers, mirrors, and students, in this case, of Jesus. Disciples are not casual students, but those who are committed to learning closely, continuously, and to be someone who embodies the teaching of their teacher, to the point where they become an extension and representation of the teacher themselves. When you are a disciple student, you take on a sort of communal identity and eventually a shared reputation with the person that you are studying under. To be a committed student of Jesus means that you are not just a student of ideas, however, but that you will be taking on a very practical and missional role. This is not something that you can study intellectually behind closed doors or just memorize and regurgitate. In fact, much of Jesus' teaching towards the disciples was literal field education. It was hands-on learning that was immediately put into praxis. There was a constant movement of learning, emulating, commissioning, reflection, correction, reteaching, and growing. And what they learned always drew the disciples or Jesus' students closer to the people instead of further away. In Matthew 10, Jesus sends his 12 disciples or students, the ones he had invited to share in his mission, into the towns and smaller cities. Jesus commands them to go into these towns to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the leprosy, and cast out unclean spirits. The mission is twofold. One, to share his teaching with the people of Israel through the practical action of miracles. In these moments, Jesus does not just want people in need to be given empty words, but he wants them to be given new circumstances and how they are able to live and move in the world. But the second part of this mission is to teach his disciples through immediate experience. Jesus was teaching his disciples that his ways should lead to healing, and towards real change in our communities that isn't delayed by over-intellectualizing or over-spiritualizing, but prioritizes practical life, restoration, and connection. When Jesus sends out his disciples to heal, he also sends them to address conditions that would have caused those who are struggling with them to be ostracized from any holy or sacred place. They are unclean, and they would have been named so by religious law. These illnesses or conditions would have banned these people and those closest to them from the temple area and often from participation in their community until they could have been made clean. Yet Jesus comes to make them clean, and often through his students to offer them a new life. Jesus empowers his disciples to heal and make the conditions better for those who are powerless and far removed from social safety. Instead of avoiding what the religious Jewish power structure forced into exile, Jesus approaches and sends his disciples to them. He teaches his students and commands them to help the untouchable become someone with whom you would dwell in their homes. If they can't go to temple, you bring the temple to them. Jesus wants his students to offer a space for others to feel human and alive again through prophetic proclamation, healing, and hospitality. Many Pharisees, scribes, and other religious leaders were teachers within ancient times. It was most likely a common and recognized practice to have a following of students, and some even traveled to give public lectures and did so to earn a living. Jesus asked his disciples instead to not receive money for their message or work, unlike some of the other teachers at the time. Jesus also asked his disciples to not pack any of their own additional funds for the journey so that they will not be tempted to pay their own way and to not rely on the hospitalities of others. For that was a crucial part of Jesus' mission and plan. For these particular students, this mission was a command to homelessness and to both give and receive radical hospitality. In regards to not receiving money for their work, Jesus clarifies that being his disciple is not something that you should be doing for profit. You can discredit the message of Jesus by using it to seek unnecessary financial gain. In Matthew 10:8, Jesus says, "You received without having to pay. Therefore give without demanding payment." The thing about Jesus' message is that if you were to begin charging those who are struggling or poor for something that is supposed to be good news to them, it probably won't seem very much like good news. But you can also get in the way of the mission of Jesus by trying to pay your own way and not relying on anyone else. Jesus did not want his disciples to bring their own payment for food or any other additional supplies they may need. Workers deserve to be fed, is what Jesus says in Matthew 10:9. Essentially, he is saying, on this journey, do not pay for your meals. Allow yourself to be fed by those who host you and welcome you into their homes. Do not just give, but receive from those who you are reaching. Part of being Jesus' disciple was to create an opportunity to exchange radical hospitality, for this is where the kingdom of heaven will flicker into our lives. Jesus wanted his students to practice their trust in humanity's goodness, even if they will not always be met with kindness and love. Providing hospitality to travelers or sojourners was a moral imperative for the Jewish people. It was a command from the law of God, but in some ways it was seen as a way that God would visit or draw near to the hosts, as the travelers would be asked to give a divine blessing upon the home that had welcomed them. In Matthew 10, Jesus tells his students to offer blessings of peace upon those that have accepted them into their homes. To Jesus, the kingdom of heaven will be realized one act of hospitality at a time. For hospitality is at the center of discipleship. To be a disciple of Jesus is to accept and receive hospitality, to allow others to co-create the kingdom of heaven on earth with you. However, we know that realistically, the world is not always a hospitable place. Sometimes resisting those that seek power over others will lead to experiencing rejection and inhospitable places. Jesus warns his disciples that being his students can come with a cost. But even in that cost, they will also be welcomed, embraced, and loved. It is important to note that even though Jesus was literally demonized, since they called him the Prince of Demons, the disciples or students themselves are not taught to return slander or dehumanize or demonize others as well. The only model that Jesus' disciples would have had for slandering or harsh criticism would be towards the religious leaders of the time who were hypocrites within their own system. Being a disciple of Jesus may come with suffering, but it is also not a position of power that should be used to attack or create unnecessary enemies. In our modern day context, it is important to realize that students of Jesus or Christians are not always victims of suffering. In that same light, we should also not search for suffering because Jesus does not command his disciples to suffer needlessly. Suffering does not make his students more holy. When Jesus sent the disciples into the towns, he says, "No heroics." Jesus himself, throughout his ministry, prudently withdraws in the face of some opposition. Sometimes escaping can be a good thing. It's okay to take back your blessing, dust off your feet, and be on your way. You do not have to match intimidation with a fight. This makes me think of all the ways we were taught to evangelize or make more disciples in the church or Christian tradition. Many times I have heard someone from a pulpit berate the congregation for not feeling the urgency of saving the lost or broken souls out there. Since judgment is coming, we should be reminding others of the danger of not belonging to Jesus when the end comes. I was even told that sometimes you need to preach judgment because there are people who will only be motivated to believe in Jesus by fear. Whether you were evangelizing or you were already a Christian, many times coercive and manipulative tactics have been used to keep people in the fold or keep people in their seats at church. But a student of Jesus might notice that Jesus did not instruct his disciples to force their way into people's homes or to try to overtly convince those who did not welcome them. Jesus also did not instruct his students to stay in their seats or in the fold. He sends them out into the homes and into the fields. Normal discipleship in Jesus' time would have gone from the bottom up. As a student, you go to learn from the teacher who is in power. Instead, Jesus moves his teaching and his students from the top down. Jesus goes from the temples and into the fields. In his instruction to his students, Jesus shows that his life and teaching is to emulate the movement of God towards humanity. Historically, in the text and in the ancient context, if Israel were under control of other empires, that would be a sign of God's distance from them. That God has abandoned his people or has sent judgment for not following God's law, and that's why empire has come to take control. But in the life of Jesus, we see God moving towards humanity, even in the face of empire, to liberate them and not destroy. Jesus instructs his students to model this and to be representatives of this movement of God towards humanity. Now, discipleship is an important theme in the book of Matthew. Many of us are familiar with its climactic final command to go and make disciples, otherwise known as the Great Commission. And this command is also as simple as this: to go and make students of all nations of the things Jesus has taught and his ways. Go make students who go from the temples to the fields, who embody what they teach, who practice radical hospitality, offer greater inclusion, and heal what needs healing. Show all the nations that even in the face of oppression, that God is moving towards you to embrace you. Now, honestly, we can't be a disciple of Jesus the same way that the people in the text could. Truthfully, we hear these words through translations, through generations of voices and traditions that had their own biases and agendas. We must be careful not to mistake being a student of Jesus with being a student of our own camps and our own histories. We must always be aware of the ghosts in the room, the people who have influenced what we believe and know, and also the voices that are missing from our community wisdom. But we can also continue to reimagine what it means to be a student of the ways of Jesus within our modern context. And to me, the message of Jesus's ways that include inclusion, radical hospitality, and the movement of God towards us from the temple into the fields is still pertinent and hopeful for us and humans today. And lastly, one marker of being a disciple or a student of Jesus is to be loved by him. In both Matthew 10 and the Great Commission in Matthew 28, Jesus commissions his disciples out. At the end of both of these passages, there is a statement of Jesus's care and love for his students. In Matthew 10, Jesus says, "Those who receive you are receiving me, and that he will reward anyone who cares for them." Jesus cares for the well-being of his students and will use his position and authority to make sure that they are okay. And in the Great Commission, Jesus states, "Look, I myself will be with you every day until the end of this present age." He promises to continue to not abandon his students and to be present to their lives. If you are a student of Jesus, I pray that you will sense the care that Christ has for you and your well-being. If you are not sure that that is you, or you do not identify as such, my prayer for you is that in the future, any encounter that you have with the student of the ways of Jesus will be filled with kindness, hospitality, inclusion, and healing. May we all continue to move towards each other, welcome each other into our homes, and offer each other blessings of peace. Thank you.